Today marks the 50th birthday of Joseph James Rogan, aka Joe Rogan, world famous stand-up comedian, signature color commentary voice of the UFC, host of the wildly popular Joe Rogan Experience podcast, and someone where I think whichever kind of area you're coming at and you find out about the guy is, to use the old line from the Transformers cartoon theme tune, there's more than meets the eye is to Joe Rogan. So interestingly enough, he's had success in these three very different areas. He's been, in some senses, almost kind of, I guess it might sound a bit highfalutin to describe him as a renaissance man, but kind of a jock renaissance man, kind of an everyman who's been able to expand into these many different areas, not just be a specialist in one. I mean, I actually first heard about him from some radio interview he gave years and years ago, talking about over a decade ago, about DMT, actually dimethyltryptamine, the very powerful psychedelic drug. And this was in combination with a story that had been told by the comedian Doug Stanhope on an earlier radio show, which then prompted a different radio show, or maybe it was the same one with Joe Rogan as a guest, to ask Joe Rogan about this story of when he'd done DMT. Doug Stanhope himself being a legendary American comedian, one of my all-time favorites. And funnily enough, Doug Stanhope also comes from Massachusetts, just like Joe Rogan, presumably where they initially got to know each other through the comedy scene there. They then got to see some of his early comedy. I mean, Talking Monkeys in Space was a pretty classic. One of his stand-ups. Started watching the UFC because I was actually interested in that as a sport, and also I found his website, joerogan.net, which had a message board on it. And at the time, especially in the mid-2000s, message boards were really great kind of content aggregators where you could find like-minded people who would post things where eventually, whatever the topic was, even if it was like about a comedian or MMA or bodybuilding or whatever, people would eventually, in the general section, they'd get bored of just talking about that one topic and they'd talk about everything that interested them. So before the days of Reddit and YouTube where you had all these algorithms and ways of aggregating and subscribing to content you're interested in, message boards really where it was at. And Joe Rogan had a very good one back in the day. It was very free flowing, a lot of freedom of speech there, and a lot of diverse topics, because Joe Rogan himself interested in a lot of things. And actually he would be kind of present on the message board. He would actually post himself and get into discussions with people. And so I kind of got into UFC through watching that, MMA more so than the UFC, because I used to watch Pride as well, which was fantastic back then, where they allowed soccer kicks to the head and they judged the whole fight, and they had the cards to stop people from fucking around, although they did abuse that a little bit. And then later on, obviously, his podcast became a thing. He actually started out just streaming. I think it was on Justin TV. He was just doing little streams, sometimes before comedy shows, when he was on the road for the UFC. And then eventually that became the podcast. And initially the podcast, it was fairly early in the game for big podcasts, especially for comedians, and that already was quite interesting in the early days. And then as it went on, they got to have bigger and bigger and bigger guests, and it became now what it is, which is almost like a little cottage industry that he runs there. Although actually, from the amounts they're pulling in now and the views, it could be his full-time job entirely. So interesting enough, before the comedy, which is really the first area he gets his big fame and success in, Joe Rogan was actually someone who had success as a Taekwondo champion at a state level, and this was something that he really dedicated himself to in the early days. I mean, I think he's told stories about how he was worried initially that, like, he was concerned about being beaten up or people being able to pick on him. So this was a way of kind of overcoming. I mean, that's a famous aspect of sports, and particularly martial arts, right? The idea that people don't want to be bullied, and so they want to be able to defend themselves, and that builds up your self-confidence and kind of establishes some level of confidence in who you are as a person, and you have some kind of set personality that you don't have to feel so lost when you're a teenager. I think some of that's going into it there. But interesting enough, even though the fact that he's a Taekwondo champion, and then the fact that later on people knew about him from the Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and the UFC, it meant that it crafted for him early on, for a lot of people who know him now, this jock persona, the idea that he's a guy who's very physical and he's got that kind of like can beat you up kind of thing. But funnily enough, that's really not who he is as a person. That's some element informing his background, but he's actually a guy who, it's pretty clear, doesn't like violence. He doesn't like the idea of people being bullied or having violence inflicted upon them if it's not something they want to be any part of. And he's someone who, interestingly enough, hasn't just gone the route of like, yeah, bro, like books are for idiots, man, for nerds and stuff. No, he's absolutely embraced all that, but he has a balanced approach to life. A lot of actual intellectuals neglect the physical world, neglect the body. They only want to exist in the imagination and in the mind and explore things rationally or through artistic expression, which is great. Absolutely, it's a fantastic area of human imagination and life, but you can't ignore the physical realm. We're all physical beings that exist here, and I think Joe Rogan's been a great influence actually on younger people over the last 10 years in terms of stressing this notion that you've got to have good diet, you've got to do exercise in some sense, you've got to develop your physical body, not least because it'll help your mental aspects. Actually, you see in a lot of men the fact that they don't work out that aggression within them, they don't work out the kind of the ape body, as it were. I'm sure that's a contributing factor to the stress buildup that we get from this modern, incredibly artificial life, which is essentially designed around industrialization and expansion and scaling up of industrial processes, which became the modern world of what we think of society and civilization as we find it now, surrounded by all this technology. Beyond the Taekwondo, though, obviously it's comedy where he really first got a name, kind of put himself out there. Now, initially, he was one of those people who broke through and was part of a successful TV show. He's part of News Radio, kind of now a cult classic 90s show. Not one I watched personally. It was kind of before my time, and obviously I don't live in America, so I don't have American television in the same way. I only got stuff like Seinfeld and The Simpsons. Now, that also, I think, played into this whole aspect of why people think he has a jock persona, because the character he plays on there, funnily enough also called Joe, is one that... For that show, this is a very crude comparison, but he's kind of the Joey from Friends of that show. He's kind of the guy who, the humor's not really that high level. It's supposed to just be like an everyday blue-collar sort of guy who's got that kind of Boston swagger about him. And there's the odd joke that has a little bit of cleverness to it, but a lot of it's kind of the more dumbed down, the more one-note character to some degree. And that's not who he is as a person, although I'm sure elements of that informed that at that particular time. Funnily enough, though, in comedy, Joe Rogan also isn't just a jock guy who like had success and just thinks his way is the best. He has a lot of respect for the old school. You always see him giving it up to some of those other guys, the ones who came before him. He respects kind of the grind of comedy and the fact that it's not just a fast track to the top. You've really got to work at it. You've got to work on your craft. You've got to want to improve for the sake of improving yourself and for your expression, not just to have more success. I mean, you notice there's a lot of people in comedy who've been doing the same hour of material for 10 years, 20 years. Now, some of them are very good. Some of them got fame off it, but have they developed themselves more? Have they pushed themselves more? No, they haven't all. Whereas Joe Rogan really kind of emphasizes that element of it. Obviously, within his comedy, he started to explore a lot of these psychedelic aspects, which has been a key kind of area of interest for him for quite some time now, particularly weed and psychedelic advocacy. That also played another element in kind of developing and kind of shading in his persona as he rose to fame. And he's someone where it's actually was, at least back then, it was pretty rare to actually hear anyone with kind of celebrity talk so openly about the fact that they do psychedelics and that they're interested in weed in this particular way, and then talk about some of the more out there aspects. And one of the interesting things about Joe Rogan is throughout his comedy and his podcast, he's always been able to work his interests into that aspect and never feel like a topic is kind of like it's off, like that's out of bounds. Like we don't talk about that, like we leave that to one side or we pretend that aspect of our life doesn't exist. He's always integrated all these aspects, and that's made it a more rich, more varied kind of base of things to talk about and to express. And I think actually as a result, I think that's part of where success has come from, because he's drawn in all these disparate elements and people can hear about him and encounter him initially in such many different areas, which then leads back to things like the UFC, like his comedy, like his podcast. He's also been someone who in general, because of this general interest in life and curiosity, has been someone who's actually pushed a lot of alternative thinking, as it were. I mean, in his earlier days, you go back a decade, you can find all these radio broadcasts where he's talking about how he thinks the moon landings are fake. And he's got some really interesting reasons, actually. He's done his own research. He even debated this guy who's the bad scientist and actually did really well in the debates. That guy almost seemed like he wasn't prepared for someone reasonable and rational to present some of the reasons as to why the moon landings could be fake. He was expecting only some really crazy kind of kook to come in and say some ridiculous things that he could easily shoot down. And he didn't really have a lot of answers for some of the things. It was quite interesting. And in his early days, that was an area where Joe Rogan was particularly kind of vehement, that he thought there was a lot of conspiracy around NASA and some of the things they'd done. Psychedelics, obviously, I mean, you can see really, he's quite overt about it, where some of his kind of influences there were. So Terence McKenna, someone I myself have been very interested in, another favorite of mine from the comedy, or Bill Hicks, who himself was influenced by Terence McKenna and the heroic 5 dried grams dose of psychedelic mushrooms, Mexican usually, by the way. And he obviously was someone very influenced by Bill Hicks. He talks about seeing Bill Hicks in the early days when he wasn't successful in America, and I think this guy was hilarious, but he was clearing out the room because people didn't get it, you know. Funnily enough, the psychedelic aspect, aside from weed advocacy, does seem like something he's drawn back from a lot. If you've only seen him in the last 5 or so years, or only the Joe Rogan Experience, in the early days, before his family life became so central and he had more kids and he'd really been with his wife for a long time, he did seem like he was someone who was heavily into the idea of DMT and exploring all these different dimensions and having these crazy experiences. You notice he doesn't talk about that as much now. He does feel like he's drawn back a lot because of family, because of wanting to be more, kind of planted, integrated into the material world, as opposed to kind of, it can get a bit slippery when you're very far out there in those psychedelic dimensions. I mean, sometimes you don't realize it when you come back. You think, I'm fully back to baseline, everything's fine. You're starting to integrate things that you experienced there. But it's only years later you realize, whoa, actually the after effects of that, they might go down to like a lower level where you can't quite detect them, but it's only when you're fully out of it that you'll realize, oh, actually, there was still some lingering effects a long time afterwards. And it seems like he just doesn't want that to be part of his life anymore. But if you go back earlier in his career, in his comedy, and in the early Joe Rogan Experiences and some of the earlier interviews, you'll find he was very much into these areas and very interested in them as alternative aspects of exploring our minds and the potential of the human imagination. He's someone in general who's always seemed to have an interest in conspiracy. With him, it's a lot of kind of the mainstream ones of like UFOs, Roswell. We've got Bigfoot is a classic one of his. We've got the NASA and the moon landing ones, the JFK murder. I mean, he's even someone who famously, that book Best Evidence is one that he was out there before the internet reading about these topics, trying to find out as much as he could about these particular aspects. He has also stepped back from that a lot in recent years. You see, every time he has Eddie Bravo on now, he'll put forward some conspiracy theories. There's some that he's interested in and will put down there and is kind of still on board with, but he's pulled back from a lot of them, especially the moon one. He's not as confrontational. He's not as confident about these aspects as he was many back in the day. And he certainly battles Eddie Bravo a lot more on these topics. In general, though, I'd say he's a free speech advocate. He's someone who's always been about being allowed to express yourself, trying to say like, oh, before we judge this person, what could he have meant by that? What was he thinking about that? I mean, famously, he doesn't say it anymore, but he actually used to be someone who originally stood up for the word faggot and the fact that the etymology of the word doesn't come from a homophobic slur. That's not what it is. That's something that was changed and actually has been changed away from again, and that it had its own place in speech. And he was willing to kind of go to ground for that and really battle people who said that you shouldn't be able to do that, and likewise calling people a cunt, etc. I mean, there's a famous thing where he called a female journalist, I think in MMA, a cunt, and then she went mental and tried to call him a sexist. But he's been willing to stand up for free speech in these ways. So he's been someone who's had his kind of own alternative area where, despite massive success in some areas, has kept it real in these respects about what he actually thinks and hasn't just told the kind of the party line, as it were, of whatever consensus political correct society tells us we're supposed to be allowed to think, that range that you're allowed to think within. Now, MMA has obviously been a huge part of the guy's life. Not only was he involved with Taekwondo earlier in his life, but then he started watching UFC in the early days, and this guy's a true fan. Like, when he got involved in working with the UFC, he was much more famous than the UFC was. And there's many, many years where he didn't work for a lot of money, and he had to go in his own free time to some of these events and take part and be the interviewer and then the commentator. When this was a sport where you're only into that sport if you're really hardcore. There were no casual fans at that point in time. Yeah, there might be the odd casual fan who went to the event and was just like, yeah, make them bleed, bro. Like, but he wasn't one of those. He's someone who had the interest in Jiu Jitsu, in Taekwondo, in stand-up, in kickboxing. Obviously, he's always someone who's being an advocate for K1. And crucially for me, when he started working with the UFC, he was someone who he didn't even just buy into the company policy where you have to think the way that they all think. Because in the early days, people won't know this, before Pride broke up, Dana White used to so hard, because he's a promoter of the UFC, used to promote the angle that like Pride was never as good. And for example, like Fedor, oh, the heavyweights aren't as good over there. You've got to come to the UFC to really prove that you're greatest. But Rogan would always give it up and give full credit to people like Fedor, like Krokop, like Shogun, like Nogueira, obviously the best guys from Pride. He always gave them their real props. And it wasn't just when they came to the UFC that he had a change of heart like other people, including the aforementioned Mr. White, did. Now, he's someone where he comes from that Taekwondo background, but he also comes from a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu background, because knowing Eddie Bravo, he's someone who did a lot of training in Jiu-Jitsu. In fact, a lot of people won't know this about Jiu-Jitsu because they'll think of it like another martial art. There's a reason why a little 11-year-old kid can become a black belt in karate, because the tests are just sort of examinations, which are almost just sort of a one-person dance that you do for your instructor to show that you learned the moves that he taught you to and did them with the right form, and then he gives you your black belt after you've gone through the belts, right? That's why they call them kind of McDojos then. Now, the difference is, in something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a black belt is the quest of a lifetime, and many people who compete in jiu-jitsu will never get to black belt with any level of teacher, because to get higher in the belts in jiu-jitsu, there's no set time and there's no examination. What happens is you do your sparring at the sessions, and when your instructor notices, you can tap out a brown belt, you can tap out a purple belt, you can tap out a blue belt. as you go through the belts, that's when you'll get given your belt. When you kind of show through actual competency and competition that you can hang with those people and that you're as good as them and that you've got the techniques that display that you're good enough to be at that level. So to get to a black belt, that can take 10 years of even very diligent work. It can take more than that. And some people will never get to that level. It's not like other martial arts. So the fact that he is a black belt in gi jiu-jitsu, wearing the white gi under Jean-Jacques Machado, a guy who has his own heritage that goes back to the original people who started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu down there in Brazil. And then in no-gi under Eddie Bravo, his friend, obviously famous for 10th Planet System and Rubber Guard. The fact he's got both those black belts and both main different types of jiu-jitsu shows that this is someone who, yes, he's done a lot in his life, but he's given a big part of his life to jiu-jitsu and trying to be very good at it. And I think that's what's made him exceptional as a commentator, because it's meant that it's not just that he got in early with the UFC and then rose with the tide of the UFC, and as the UFC got huge, he was really huge. He was bigger than the UFC for the majority of the time until probably a few years ago when the UFC became kind of supernovaed and became this big global phenomenon. And he's someone where he is legitimately a world-class MMA commentator. He's someone where I still think he's fantastic to this day, even with all the people that are getting involved now. People will talk about his bias and say he's biased one with it. I can tell you as myself, someone who's worked analyzing people and having to give your opinions about people, to some degree there will always be bias. There's what things you value more and what criteria you value above others. You have to select those. You can't just be uniformly open to all criteria and never have any kind of qualitative judgment, because that is your job as the color commentator, as someone analyzing the sport. Likewise, in order to be able to structure how you talk about a fight or a game or a match, you have to almost pick one of the sides to commentate to some degree from their perspective from. As in, if one person's the champion and he's winning and then the other person starts to come back, sometimes you have to commentate initially from like, oh, what can the champion do now? How can he battle back? What are his flaws at this point in time? You can't be giving all the information at once. You have to select the storylines that you can talk about now and give kind of a coherent thread throughout the fight, throughout the match, whatever it might be. I feel like people go way too far on that. I will say, I do think that Joe Rogan does overly hype when it comes to like the countdowns when they're building into the fight, and particularly he overhypes not just how good the fighters are, like they're all like, oh, they're all dangerous knockout power. Like he does overhype that a little bit, but also he does seem to overly stress sometimes current history, like the current champion is always he's the pound for pound best guy now, and oh, he's the greatest of all time in this division. I think sometimes he doesn't take as much of a macro view, but then again, he's very much in the day-to-day of watching all the fights, isn't he? And that is also quite common across, first of all sports. Like, look at all these fuckers saying like LeBron's better than Michael Jordan already, and all competitive disciplines. I can tell you in my own native eSports, people are mad for, like, whoever the current champion is, whoever wins has to be the best, and they have to be the best of all time, and oh, the other guys in the past, they wouldn't have done anything. People in general are like that. I will say the one area where Rogan was ridiculous, I think just patently ridiculous in his hyping, was Ronda Rousey. Like, she was a very good fighter for a woman at the time, very much of her time, and she was a groundbreaker and an innovator in many ways. But when he was like talking about how she could beat certain men, like, come the fuck on. Even back then I was like, yeah, you're losing me a bit here, mate. He went way too far along that hype train to where it was obviously heading off a cliff at some point in time. Whether she'd beaten all the women or not, she was never going to beat those men. That was ridiculous. Interestingly enough, though, speaking about esports, as someone who is a nerd and who came from the world of esports, a lot of people might not know this, but Joe Rogan has his own history, not in esports itself, but in competitive video games. Because in the early 2000s, he was playing Quake 3. He even paid for like a business level line so he could have good internet, and he had like a fast PC, and he was playing in a clan at the time with a bunch of people. And obviously Quake 3, one of the earlier esports games, that was like 1999 to about 2001 that it was still a big game. He's someone, though, who hasn't been involved in competitive gaming since then because he thinks it's too addictive for him. He's someone who says he has an addictive personality for certain kind of sports or activities. I think it actually ties into his interest in pool that he had when he was a younger man as well, because he seems to love sports based around both precision, so they're very, very hard to do, but technique as well. And when you build up the technique, that feeds into how the efficacy, how good your precision is and how impactful you can be in that sense. It's those two aspects that seem to attract him in some sense. I mean, currently seems to be quite interested in archery for similar reasons. Obviously, his podcast has become one of the main things he's known for now. Like, people who don't even follow MMA, don't give a fuck about comedy, you can show them a podcast. You can say, hey, watch the Alex Jones one, or hey, watch the Jordan Peterson one, or the Ben Shapiro one, or Maynard James Keenan. He's had so many people on at this point in time. He basically has the best podcast, the number one podcast in the world for my book. And yet what's funny is, despite it now might be his biggest venture, it began as a goof. He was just doing it for fun with his friends and with other comedians he was with and trying to get things going, just having fun. He wasn't making loads of money off it. It wasn't a career path he was going down. But that's key, because for me, This ties into how he got his success in MMA. He's a guy who has interests, is open to new things, is always curious and exploring. And when he finds things he's interested in, he follows that interest. He maintains his curiosity for things that catch his attention. And in doing so, he's found success in areas like MMA, like the podcast, that other people might have been vaguely interested in, but wouldn't have gone down. They'd be like, oh, I'll never make any money from that. That's a waste of time. Like, I'll do that on the side every now and then, but I'm never going to waste like main time where I could be doing something else. No, he's followed those areas. And because he's so curious and dedicated to following these areas, they've become their own fully fledged things on their own. That's something where he has been quite influential to me. He has been someone where I've always taken that approach myself. Like I've always said in eSports, people ask me like, how can you keep going in eSports after 16 years, coming on 17 years, following all these games, all these, how do you stay interested? I'm more interested than ever because I maintain a curiosity, because there's always something I want to investigate. There's always some detail I want to get shade in of someone's background that'll then help me understand something else. There's always some aspect outside of esports I can bring into it, just as Joe Rogan brought all these disparate elements into his comedy and into his podcast that will then inform and change how I think about the current thing, and then I can find a new kind of springboard to go into something else. And if anything, it's like a muscle. You build it up and you get more curious and more interested over time, not less. You don't get jaded in that way, and that's why I think his podcast to this day is very, very good. Then you've got to consider he's someone where he had that jock persona, but I think now you have to be considering him as almost like a jock intellectual, because yes, he's not like a pure intellectual, he's not like a philosopher who sits around just thinking all day, or who's had a very high level of education, or is specialized in one area. But for someone people would think is just an everyman who succeeded in certain areas, he is very open to kind of aspirational ideas about what's possible and how you can think about the world, and doesn't seem to be the guy who thinks, oh, well, I'm too dumb to know about that, so I won't even bother learning it. Then he'll try and find someone who can explain it to him, and he'll start to make inroads into it. It seems to have confidence that you can at least get somewhere if you apply yourself in this way. His philosophies actually have been one of the areas where I found him quite interesting and influential in my own life. I mean, first of all, he's the guy who really laid it out there, something that very much has informed how I think about life, which is, I can't remember where he laid it out, but he said that his philosophy for life is that it's about trying to develop your human potential. I think that's a great way to describe it, because often most people think, philosophy for life, right, to be happy. Well, no, for me, happiness it's like a fleeting aspect. It's like trying to chase the horizon. You might get to where the horizon was and then be in that place, and maybe that's cool, but the horizon will always be away from you. You can never reach it. And so in the same ways, you can't just reach happiness. It's not a state you can just permanently be in. But if you develop your human potential, you find things you're interested in, you find things you want to improve upon, you explore all aspects of your personality and who you are as a being, then I think happiness is going to be a byproduct along the way, along with satisfaction, along with growing opportunities, along with the ability to have some freedom over what you do with your life. I think these things will all follow, and that's something that's always been in the back of my mind. I think he's one of the first people to really explicate that, despite the fact I've read so many books of people who you think of as great philosophers. He's someone where certain aspects of philosophy that have informed his own life I've thought have really been interesting. Like I did a video about The War of Art, the Stephen Pressfield book, which he's the first person that brought that up to me. The concept of resistance and the really grinding approach. I mean, he's really applied it to his comedy. Most famously, he always talked about how he took Louis C.K.'s approach, where you write a new year of comedy every year. You don't just write one and go, well, that's wicked, I'll stick with that for a few years. Then when I've got another special coming up, I'll do it. No, he writes it, he performs it, he does the special, and then he throws it out and he starts all over again. That pushes you to higher levels. It makes you aspire to be greater than just having some good stuff and working in the odd new joke, etc. Obviously, a classic one that he doesn't mention so often nowadays is Miyamoto Musashi's The Book of Five Rings. This is one where this really informs kind of his martial mentality of the idea of like discipline and respect and technique. The idea that it's not just about strength or speed, it's about technique, being able to defeat people. Obviously, that's massively influential for Jiu Jitsu, where the smaller guy really can win out with superior technique and application of himself over someone with a weight, a height, a speed advantage over him. I think actually one of the keys that people don't mention enough for me as to why Joe Rogan's podcast has been so successful is the way he's included his friends in it, the people that are around him who weren't famous. People like Joey Diaz, Ari Shafir, Duncan Trussell, these guys weren't famous comedians at the time Joe Rogan started including them in his stuff. But I think, first of all, they're all brilliant people in their own respective ways. They're all really fun personalities. They're all fun to hear. They add in a little extra element of spice to a podcast. And that made his podcast very unique, because he's the only guy who had those people involved early on. Yes, then he would get big stars and his friends from MMA and other celebrities and comedians, etc. But having these guys as a baseline gave it a very unique flavor. And each of those people in their own way are really cool. Like, I love Joey Diaz. He's obviously one of the most hilarious people ever. He's really developed into a great comedian when he was more just the kind of the shit-talking guy early on who could probably occasionally pull it off on stage. Duncan Trussell's obviously a really out there kind of psychedelic guy in his own right. That's like, if you're into the psychedelic version of Joe Rogan 10 years ago, go down the Duncan Trussell route, because he's fully into that shit, and you'll absolutely have your fill. I think ultimately Joe Rogan's a guy, he's got a great personality. He seems to get along with everyone. That's why his podcast is so good. He's able to get people to open up. He's a guy who's humble, is very amiable. He doesn't seem like, despite getting good in certain areas himself, like he's very arrogant in that sense. I think if you want to see what an amiable guy he is, I remember ages ago on his podcast, there was an episode where it was him, it was Brian Redban, who used to be his old producer, and it was Ari Shafir. And when they were talking, Joe Rogan told this story that he told many times before about how when he was a young kid, one time his father beat the shit out of his mother because his mother had like something like hadn't prepared a good meal, like she'd only gotten like hamburger meat or something, and his dad, who was apparently domestically violent, just exploded and punched her. And Redban made like what at the time was like a shit joke. Like he tried to sort of improv a joke, which Redban famously often did, and a lot of people didn't like that, where he just said some joke like, hey, yeah, she deserved it. Now, a lot of people, even if that's your friend, even if, yes, it's supposed to be a joke, you might at least react to that. I mean, what the fuck? Why are you saying that? But actually, the way he played this, he totally understood the context. He didn't let his ego get involved in it. He knew this as a friend of his. He let it go. It wasn't a big deal. What an amiable guy, right? I don't know many people who'd react that way. He's a guy who's always maintained a positive mental attitude. I realize that's become a cliched term, but it helps. It's a big thing in life. And he's someone who, no matter what happens in life, seems to always have that positivity, which is part of what I think drives him forwards. And partly I think it's based in the fact that he has learned so many things. He has been curious and been rewarded for that so many times. He has gotten to know new things, integrated them into what he knew before, and hasn't been so stubborn with the old thoughts, and therefore has progressed. And so he sees that you don't have to worry about the fact you don't know everything yet, about things are going badly. If you apply yourself, if you work, if you grind, if you've got the war of art mentality, then you can get to a better level. Everything can be improved, even if things are going badly right now. And crucially, as I said, he's always remained curious and interested. So I think the best way to summarize Joe Rogan, for me personally, and this is, I don't know if he'd like this analogy or what, because obviously it plays against the idea that, you know, weed being a gateway drug has been massively overplayed. But I would say Joe Rogan is a gateway drug to interesting people, topics, and philosophies on life.